Hello everyone, um, welcome to the 82nd edition of Elixir Berlin, this time in like the July edition. So we will get started soon. I am very happy to have an event after a break. So this just want to walk through what we are going to do today, or what's the agenda. So basically, everyone who hasn't joined yet, please join our Discord channel. That's where we usually do any discussions and follow-up questions after the talks. As well, you can ask questions there that the presenters can answer at the end of their talks. We are also present on GitHub, on Twitter, and other places, so you feel free to follow us there. Yeah, so the live sessions are happening on YouTube, and QAs and Hangout on Discord. If you haven't, please join. The link is here below. Yeah, just for those who haven't joined yet, I'll leave this screen for now open, and would we'll use that time to say that in case you have any interesting projects you were working in or are working in, we are always happy to hear about those. Please reach out to us either on GitHub, Meetup, or anywhere else, and yeah, share your projects with us and with the community. As well, we are hoping to resume in presence, or at the physical location soon. We are looking for hosts and not as well as speakers. So if your company is ready and willing to host a meetup, you can as well reach out to us. The agenda for today, we will have two talks. One is going to be from Florian, who is going to talk about utilizing open APIs to enforce standards between teams. He will elaborate more on that soon. And afterwards there will be another talk about securing internal apps with Cloudflare Auth, Cloudflare Access, done by me. Um, Usually we do have lightning talks, and you still can apply for one if you want to do one now. Um, but you have to have either a short recording of your lightning talk or OBS setup. Then you can do a lightning talk as well. Reach out to us. We'll see whether it works during the event. If not, afterwards, please hang out in Discord and um, yeah, chat with us. Yeah, so if you have questions, please write those in the general chat with a Q in front, and then at the end of the talk, the uh, speaker will read those and answer to those if he will have the time. That is it. So I'll switch off and we'll soon, and I'll check with Florian whether he is ready, and if he is, I can give the mic to him.
Check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2. That was a handover. Nice. Cool. Let's get this party started. Good evening, everybody. From my home in Berlin. Hope you, wherever you are, you're well and healthy. And I'm coming to you today with a talk about OpenAPI and its role for teams. And full disclaimer here, this is a talk about standards. So there is one obligatory thing that I'm contractually obliged to show you before we even start with the talk, which is the obvious XKCD. If you don't read XKCD, that's a mistake and that's on you. So you should go and start reading XKCD. Anyway, again, good evening and hi. I'm Florian. Some of you might remember me from one or another Elixir Conf. I used to work for Klöckner doing a lot of like steel things and love to talk about the steel industry for a while. I've been away for a little bit, but I'm back and it's good to be back. Yeah, these days I work for a company called Contentful. We're mostly doing headless CMS things. So if you want to put your content on the interwebs, no problem, we got you covered. You can come to us. We'll offer you a pretty sleek interface to manage all of it and a pretty nice API to actually get all of it into your static sites if you like via JavaScript. And we're also hiring. I'm also somewhat obliged to tell you that. Yeah, if you're good at Ruby or JavaScript, or if you're just technology and a technology enthusiast, please like talk to me. I can point you in the right direction. We have a super nice, super diverse, super friendly team. Um, it's really, really a nice place to work at least for me, it was for the past year, and I hope we can welcome you soon if you seek a new job. We're hiring, but I can tell you, and this is a little bit of gossip right now about my own company, we have a problem. And as problems grow, this one is actually a good one because this problem is called growth. And all the venture capitalists in the room just went like, "What? Growth? I like growth, but yeah, I'm sorry to say, like growth can be a problem, especially when you're growing your team over time. When you like take your one developer team and you slice that up over time, and you create more and more teams because after a while you realize, okay, like we grew from one team to three teams, and this was kind of like okay, this was a little bit cumbersome sometimes. Like they didn't talk to each other, they went into different directions, and was a little bit of a mess. But imagine you had even more teams, and we're talking like 10 or 20 in little groups. Like they all have special knowledge, they all know each other. They like they do their own thing. And if you're into Elixir or into Erlang, you might have heard about this, about Metcalfe's law, which kind of says, okay, like the number of parties, like the communication required, like between those parties, between the nodes in the system, grows faster than the actual nodes. So in this example, like if we have three teams, they have to talk with each other. We have three potential connections, and that's cool. Everything works. If we grow this to eight, we already are at like 56 potential connections. So yeah, that gets out of hand real fast. And as anyone knows, when you have a lot of teams and these teams have to work on a common goal into like one exact direction, then yeah, you can run into problems if they don't talk to one another. So what do we do? Um, I mean, pretty easy. Don't we just force people to communicate, right? Like we just tell them to talk to one another, and that'll work, right? Sort of. From experience, I can tell you that this works to a certain degree, and at some point it just stops. At some point, you have teams that do isolated things. Maybe you have teams inside of your infra team that kind of like go on and do their own thing, and then you have like like a front end team that tries to build a new feature, relies on like three other teams. In practice, like for all practical purpose, we can't really just like tell everybody to talk to one another. It's just not really efficient. We have to somehow make it discoverable. Like we have to like make our work available to others. Like every team has to do that, and then we have to forge some sort of agreement that people can work with the work that other teams produce, if you catch my drift. Having said all that, so we can kind of force agreements, and some of you might know the term. We can employ what's called contract testing. Contract testing is pretty popular, like the assumption being that I can basically write a contract and then both parties like agree to the contract and fulfill each other, so to speak. In API terms, let's say my front end depends on a certain outer schema of the API, then I can like have a contract in between, and as long as both sides agree to fulfill the contract, everything's peachy. Um, Going a little bit into Ruby territory here, like there is Pact available for this. Some of you might have used it. I personally recommend trying it out. Pact is pretty nice because Pact allows you to essentially, and I will like demonstrate a very, very simplified version of this. Like assuming you are a client, oops, assuming you are a client and you're wondering like all day long about your new feature and you might require something off of an API, the way you do this in Pact is essentially tell the provider of that API through a broker that you want something, you want X. And then in turn, the provider is obliged to give you that feature. Like you want to extend the API, cool, the provider now has to fulfill the contract where you demand it. It's what we call consumer driven. And it kind of works. At least it worked for us for a while in Contentful. But yeah, it kind of had its drawbacks. So what are the drawbacks? Um, First of all, it required a surprising amount of Ruby knowledge, which is really tough, at least in a lot of teams where we have a lot of good Ruby engineers in Contentful, but we also have a lot of like JavaScript only people, and they kind of like had a lot of trouble especially in debugging. So whenever like our CI pipeline, who like checks the fulfillment of contracts, went wrong, people had a tough time debugging. We also ran into some troubles with the broker itself. Overall, high friction solution for our purposes. Didn't really click. People don't really like it. The consumer driven approach, and this is more of a big thing, also really didn't fit our model. Like we go internally for full team ownership. So that means the teams kind of control themselves what they provide and what they work on. And that doesn't really fit with a lot of consumers depending on them. And it also doesn't really scale with the consumers. So the problem really is that the more and more clients you get, driving changes across the demands of many consumers is really, really hard, especially if you're the one provider who now has to fulfill all of these contracts. So that that really doesn't scale. And I mean, if your company has ambition and wants to grow really big and wants to add more developers to the mix, then scaling this model is really tricky. Nevertheless, if you're interested in contract testing, go for pack, try it out, see if it works. My gut feeling would be that it would be really nice, or it's really nice for smaller teams, or actually also for open source projects where you have like a big audience and you can actually have a sort of like group agreement process where you then go for the fulfillment of a specific contract. Um, we wanted, like, in the end, for us, like, we want what we looked for and what we currently try to aim for is more of a provider driven model. So we kind of want to like put all of this on its head. Uh, so essentially, we want to make teams responsible, like the owners, the providers of APIs, responsible for telling other teams how their API is to be used going forward. And then making changes to that would also like proliferate throughout the organization to all the clients. But it has to be driven by the provider for this. And I hear some in the audience metaphorically saying like, yeah, but what about GraphQL? You talk about schema, you talk about contracts, just use GraphQL internally. And my answer to that right now is like jein. It's German for yes and no. GraphQL is really nice because essentially it allows clients to declare like what they want, and then the API is like dynamic. The schema is essentially dynamic to fulfill queries defined, or like to fulfill legal queries defined on the requests from clients. Um, this has a lot of advantages actually. Like using GraphQL internally between teams, or obviously also towards front ends, is really cool. Like because clients can define what they want out of your interface. It's also really hard because query analysis, and the fear, especially internally, is that you can easily overwhelm a single service offering a GraphQL endpoint with a complex query. If you ever worked with Absent, for example, in Elixir, like you have a lot of like there you have a whole problem space where you need to analyze queries that come in and prevent people from taking down like your system with a nested set of like resources that they query from you. Overall, it's tricky and the risk is pretty high that like a single rogue service or a single rogue team then just like takes down your service by a very by querying that essentially. So what's left? Um, JSON APIs. JSON APIs are pretty nice. Like I hope that most developers have sort of like an understanding of what I mean by JSON APIs. JSON APIs can follow an arbitrary format. You can come up with your own standard, and I mean there is a lot of standards out there. Spoiler alert: Contentful has their own standards for JSON API, or for making JSON APIs, for making them RESTful. We have a whole outer format, and all our APIs, customer facing at least, are set or like are required to look the same. My recommendation is always to look to like open source and to the community. There's also standards you can employ for JSON APIs. One of the more popular ones that I know off the top of my head is, of course, the aptly named JSON API standard, which I linked in the slides. So you can look all these resources up. And for JSON APIs, there is standards to follow, namely OpenAPI, the artist formerly known as Swagger. Some of you might remember this, but like Swagger was originally like a little tool where I could declare my OpenAPI spec. I could describe my OpenAPI using YAML or JSON, um, to the Swagger client, and then the Swagger client would give me like this HTTP query test interface, and you could basically serve this client as part of your API, and then people could play around with your API. So what does that look like in practice? OpenAPI these days, they kind of dropped the name Swagger. If you search it now, like you should look for OpenAPI spec. They're already in version 3. It's pretty straightforward, a listing of all the endpoints that you provide. This one, by the way, here is like straight out of their documentation. It's basically a list of like how to interact with your API, describing all the requests possible and describing all the responses possible. As an addition, and this is not included here, like OpenAPI also offers you to describe your schema. That means your JSON schema specifically. If your API uses models, for example, if you have a product API, then product would most likely be a model. You could also include that schema in there so that other people can reason about like what entities exist in your domain, and you can basically declare to others, these are my entities. These can get created out of certain endpoints. These need to be requested to certain endpoints, and it's all really nice. Actually, it's really straightforward. It's YAML, so it's readable. Unless, of course, you're working as a sysadmin these days and do a lot of Kubernetes, then you find YAML probably atrocious. Nevertheless, if you keep it at same levels, it's a pretty nice way to describe your API. So why does my presentation? So what does that mean for like a single provider? Like what does this give me essentially? Like in terms of like what can I do with it? Well, it reverses the model. Me as a provider on the left here can actually offer a spec to a client, and that client having a spec in a certain version, and this bit is important, can now actually go and validate all of its requests on their own against a version of my spec. And if I offer a new spec, that client can go and say, oh, like all of these requests that I have in my test suite right now that I test for, I can test this against your new version of the spec. And I can tell just by looking at the spec whether or not my requests will actually be successful. And if I cover all the cases, for example. And that's actually really nice because it kind of like doesn't put a lot of pressure on the provider anymore. The provider can just like emit a spec into the list of clients, and the clients can all make sure that this new version of the spec is compliant with the requests that they're making, and everyone can sort of be happy. On the left side, of course, like the provider itself can also validate its own responses to its own spec because the spec also contains the responses. So the provider can also be reasonably sure that when they put out a new version of their spec, they would then also be able to provide all their responses with the API. Again, this image is grossly oversimplified. There's like a lot of tooling in play here that I completely omitted from what I just told you. But in theory, at least, this all works. So that means we can use it in practice at some point. So this works better, at least in Contentful. This works really well for us. So it kind of, I hinted to this, like teams can now define what their services offer as part of their service or centralized if they want to. I can like explain that bit a little bit later. And teams own the spec. So they can say, hey, this is my current API. This is how you need to interact with it. And the complexities of Pact are kind of out of this picture. Like there's not a lot of pressure anymore. There's no broker in between that you need to worry about. There's no extra server. There's nothing to debug here. Like you look at the static file and you evaluate your requests and your responses against it, and you can be reasonably sure that it'll work if both sides actually have passing test suite around this. And the nicest part for me, at least, is that it's platform and tech independent. I know I'm speaking at the Elixir meetup right now, and I would love to tell you that everything should be Elixir and we should be using the internal actor model across a super scaled set of beams. It's not the case in Contentful, at least, and it's not the case in a lot of other companies. We tend to have non-homogeneous, heterogeneous environments where there's a lot of technologies. And the good news is that OpenAPI is just a YAML file, and most technologies that we all use actually has support for parsing YAML. And there's a surprisingly long list of technology support as well. So a lot of languages um, support OpenAPI tooling, which is really nice. So what's the actual strategy that we use in Contentful here? So I alluded a little bit to it on the left side here. Like we have the services owned by individual teams, and what we do is we store the specifications in a centralized specification repo. It's like a repository only containing a little bit of glue code, admittedly, and it also contains all the OpenAPI specs for each and every one of the services. The reason why this is centralized in our case is that it gives us the ability to individually version the set of all OpenAPI specs, which is really nice because that means you can advance the design of your spec independent of what you do in your repository, and the repository, like the service repositories themselves, can effectively be dependent on this like centralized specifications repo. There's a couple of other benefits that we have from this. We essentially can generate documentation from these specifications as well. It's something I didn't mention, but the OpenAPI specification can also contain Markdown, which you can then use to create really nice um, documentation for your users that are hopefully using your API. Another thing is that we internally use a tool called Stoplight. I included the link in the notes to these slides. Stoplight is a tool that effectively provides you with a UI around these YAML files and makes like the handling of all the YAML a little bit easier on you, gives you a little bit more of a point and click feel to it. It's really nice to use. I recommend you trying it out. I think it's still free for open source efforts, so it's a really nice tool in case you don't want to remember all of the OpenAPI specification or write YAML by hand, which I could relate to, I think. So this is how it works for us. It works really well because basically all like it allows me to tell other teams, look, like here's a new service, look over there, look to the repository, to the central schema repository, find the name of the service, and just look at the specification and start integrating against it, and you're done. And I don't even have to provide the service myself yet. I can write the specification before I even write the service. So that's really, really nice. So why is that useful even in the long run? Okay, you now have a ton of contracts between teams and they all fulfill it. And what's the benefit? Why should I, in my little company, use that? First thing I have to say this is if you have only a small team, like a small group of developers, like 2, 3, 4, 5 people, might not be for you. You might get away with like just simple communication channels and coordinating on Slack. Like, don't enforce a standard where there is no need for a standard. Like, if you can, like, talk to people, talk to people. But you can collect a version description of all of your APIs, and this is useful. You can basically say, this is version 1 of my API, of all my APIs that like collectively make up our big API to all of our product in one version, which is a big advantage because you can also go back in the history and then like basically go from like version 1 to version 2 to version 3, and it's really nice. You can also allow clients to depend on a set of your APIs instead of just one API. uh, you can generate, and this is the really nice part. If you offer an API and you need like clients, for example, or servers, you can generate them. You can generate API clients out of OpenAPI specifications, and there is a surprising number of supported languages for that, including Erlang, including Elixir. Um, the code quality from what I've seen isn't the greatest, but you get like a baseline client out of this. If your company offers an SDK, for example, you can then use this baseline client, generate it, and like write wrapper code around it to make it nice and usable for your end users. It just saves you a ton of work. I know like some people like who have to maintain the SDKs and the clients like that are written by hand. It's a ton of work, and these people deserve all of our respect because it's a very thankless job to maintain like an API client over a long period of time to maintain it, especially if you do it manually. The generation works. I've linked in the comments to these slides. I've linked a couple of tools that can help you try this out if you want to. Of course, like the holy grail, and we haven't achieved this in Contentful yet, is to integrate this into our CI so that when a new version of our API is released, that we automatically get also a new version of the client. You can generate documentation, and I know, again, I'm talking in the Elixir meetup. Like, I hope all of you know the value of documentation. It's one of the primary reasons why I love the language and the ecosystem so much, because documentation for like the majority of all of us in the Elixir and Erlang space is a first-class citizen. Like, it's not just like an afterthought. Like, and if you worked with other languages and ecosystems, you know how painful it can be when you have to go into every dependency's code base and actually try to figure out what's going on. Generating good documentation from your API specs is a real nice benefit, and I encourage all of you that use OpenAPI to leverage that. Um, you can do verification in your own tests because these specifications are just YAML files. You can hand it to the client and you can hand it to the server, and both code bases essentially can write their own unit tests against the spec to verify that their code works against the spec. And so you don't have like a broker in between anymore. And much, much more. Like, I put a link here because the list of OpenAPI tooling available is pretty extensive. And I encourage you to look it up. It's a rabbit hole that is absolutely worth to get lost in. So, did we solve the communication issue? Nah, not really, unfortunately. Like, we didn't really solve any communication issues. Like, I would love to say like, hey, there's this magic piece of software that like enables like teams to work independently of one another. Nobody has to know anymore what's going on. They can all just like laser focus on their own issues. No. Like, if you take anything away from this presentation, then let me tell you that this is most likely impossible. You still have to talk to other people. After all, this is software engineering, which, as we know, is not really about computers. It's about people and their connections. So this really doesn't solve anything related to communication, just makes it easier to automatically test, integrate, and verify. And yeah, talk to your fellow engineers. It's often worth it. And we have arrived at part two, and I'm just glancing at the time real quick. Roughly 20 minutes in, almost done. How are we doing in the Elixir space, actually? And the answer to that, thankfully, is we're doing pretty well. If you just want to auto-generate OpenAPI from your existing code base, if you use Phoenix, for example, there's Phoenix Swagger out there, which you can look at. Works pretty well from what I can tell. But of course, like, it needs more adoption. It needs more. It needs more. More like. Oh, I forgot my English. I'm sorry. It needs more people to look at. It needs more exposure is the word. It needs more exposure to the community. So I encourage you to try that out. I've mentioned already that you can easily generate OpenAPI clients for Elixir as well. I have looked at the code from OpenAPI generator. It's usable. It's usable. Could be better, but yeah, we'll see. There's a lot of it missing though, and this is where I have to call for libraries. Like, we as a community, I think, should make the effort to actually like get more stuff into the or get more involved in the ecosystem around OpenAPI. And there's some libraries just missing, like stuff that we don't have at the moment, which could prove really useful, especially given the fact that Erlang and Elixir are really really good at writing servers. And I have a shameless plug, of course, at this point, because I've been active in this like OpenAPI tooling problem for a while now. I wrote a small application, or I started to write a small application that would take in a OpenAPI spec and would generate mock servers on demand, essentially. The way this works is that essentially you would start a server, you would post your OpenAPI spec to the server, it would generate a small server for you, and the client could then run its test suite against the mock, or it could just like pretend that that is the real server and can verify that it works correctly. And after a while, we just delete the on-demand server and go on with our life. This is really nice to do in Elixir because I think since version 110 we have something called a dynamic supervisor, which essentially looks like this. And I'm sorry for the big code dump at this point. A dynamic supervisor, as opposed to a normal supervisor, is dynamic. So whereas you have a supervisor where you can define children statically, usually on startup, like think of a list of workers that you want to start alongside your application code. The important bit for the dynamic supervisor is that instead of relying on init, it has a function. Whoops, sorry. Can I? Whoops. Thank you, Google. It has a function included called start child. And the start child function essentially like takes the place of init, and you can, while the dynamic supervisor runs, actually add more processes to the supervisor. In the case of Mimikry, I actually use this to start um, ad hoc servers, ad hoc processes that represent these API servers, to then start serving under a URL essentially. And this works really nicely. If you have a problem similar to that, where you, for example, have to start jobs via an API call, go look into that. That's really nice. And I think with this, I'm at the thank you slide, which doesn't say thank you, but it says link to slides. I'll post the link later in the Discord. And I will now go over to the questions. And we have one question from Hugo, who asks, what are the biggest downsides, issues with OpenAPI and at Contentful? The biggest downsides and issues are mostly related to adoption. So Contentful has roughly, and I think Asaki can like correct me on the numbers for this one, we have roughly 200 services in operation at the moment, and not all of them are like OpenAPI spec'd. We also have some issues in terms of what API version are we using, because it hasn't been consistently adopted over time. So we're like spending a good amount of time to actually like backfill these and actually also get to version 3 of OpenAPI, with the guidance that if you write a new service in Contentful right now, that needs an OpenAPI spec. So you can't get away with not providing one. You're held to that. So the biggest issue right now is just adoption, which is also why I'm pretty much vocal about this topic and really like talking about this topic, because I see this as a form of interface that kind of bridges the whole technology discussion. Like as with any other group of developers, like in Contentful, we do have a lot of discussion, like what's the best technology to use for X, and then somebody says JavaScript, and then somebody else, mostly me, says Elixir, and then a third party says Ruby. To me, OpenAPI bridges this gap, um, and just provides you with this common interface. And I hope that answers the question. From Sultan, question: is there any integration with type specs and automatic generation? The honest answer to this is I do not know. The last client I generated for Elixir did not have type specs. The tooling I used is a Java generator, so you and it's open source, so you can probably backfill it. To my knowledge, it's not integrated with type specs, unfortunately. Another question from Hugo: are you actively moving old services to OpenAPI? The answer to that is yes. We have a central Rails monolith that is currently not fully spec'd. It's only partially spec'd in OpenAPI version 2. And I took it upon me to upgrade the spec. And since that spec is also part of the test suite, there is a bit of RSpec upgrades. We have an RSpec helper that like is used for validation. That's currently in the works. Question: does it help to deprecate endpoints, and do you somehow monitor API usage? To your second point, do we monitor API usage? Yes, we do. We're an API first company and a platform first company. And does it help to deprecate endpoints? Yes, we don't like at Contentful. We don't do like API version 1 and then like suddenly switch to API version 2. We gradually evolve our APIs much more in line with how you would evolve like a GraphQL schema, for example. So the deprecation of endpoints does happen, but since all of our clients depend on our API being somewhat stable, it's usually a slow and arduous process. I don't want to rush through this. Are there any more questions? Kind of waiting on Scudality to finish typing at this point. Yeah. Thank you for listening to me then, and I will hand it back to Fugo now, who will hopefully take over again.
Wow, thank you. Um, yeah, so I guess I have to. One second. Yeah. Sad that I didn't realize sooner that I muted. I'll try to do it quick. First of all, thanks Florian. Join the Discord channel if you want to ask questions to Florian. Yeah. Basically, so I want to talk about Cloudflare Access and how you can use to optimize your or like how you can use it internally to ease up authentication of internal applications. That's what we do with that at my company. And like instead of showing you slides, I'll just quickly walk you through how it works, or like the easiest path to success, let's say. I'm sorry if you're already familiar with Cloudflare Access. If not, this might be useful to you. So basically, Cloudflare nowadays, like I guess it started as a security DNS provider and CDN. By now, it is really loads of more. So one of their features is called Cloudflare Access, which allows you to have user authentication, quite granular, with roles and so on, for any application served or proxied through Cloudflare. So let's say this is an old site I built, my own homepage that hasn't been refreshed for more than 10 years probably. But okay, so like I'll use it just for as an example to add authentication to this site. What I will try to do is basically I'll try to add user logging to this page for anyone who wants to visit it, and so that you can actually do within few clicks. So you just choose the domain it's hosted, go to Cloudflare Access. The good thing is that Cloudflare Access is free for up to 50 users, so that was not the case before the crisis. Set up application access. Yeah, so they have different UIs, which might be confusing. And this is not exactly the UI I was using before, but I'll try to do that through this one. Okay, so basically you have to set up the access, and basically who, like in this case, include validate access groups, common name, IP ranges, email ending. Okay. Launch Teams. I guess I will try to find the other UI that was more intuitive. I guess this one is the Teams API. The Teams UI is the one that I was using before. Yeah, add application. Self-hosted application. Enter the name. Enter the domain that you want to protect. You can protect specific paths. In this case, we will just protect the whole thing in general. You can add a logo to your sign-in UI, and yeah. So for the free plan, you can only choose one identity provider, which is one-time PIN. That means that in the UI, you put in your email, it will send you a PIN, you enter the PIN, and you are in, if you are allowed to access based on your based on the rules that are configured. Yeah, so here are configured rules, authenticated public, and I'll just put a login method, so everyone who logs in with this PIN supposed to have access to the site. We don't need course, we don't want to set cookies, and that's pretty much it. We are done. So yeah, so we have Cloudflare Access function set up, and it should work. At the moment, it already does. So one thing that you have to remember is that you have to proxy, like, so Cloudflare has to not only provide a DNS for the domain, but it also has to be, the requests have to be proxied through Cloudflare for this to work. That in the Cloudflare UI it basically looks like this. So this is proxied entry, and this is only serving DNS. So as soon as you will disable proxying, your authentication will be gone. So yeah, we can I'll try to log in quickly. Gmail. Hopefully I don't have any embarrassing emails there. Coming in. Hope. Not yet there. Okay, so while I am waiting, I'll try to explain the idea of the library. So okay, so if that thing works perfectly and you don't have to do any code on your application side, so why did I create a library? So there is one issue that we noticed. So first of all, like, there could be people trying to access your IP directly instead of going through Cloudflare. If your IP is known to some other parties, yeah. Or what we have had cases where someone just disables proxying and then leaves it to DNS only for testing, and ends up forgetting to leave that, making the application publicly accessible to everyone. So that's why this application is there. So what Cloudflare, like this library, what Cloudflare does is it sends a header request to get a header entry together with the request with a JVT token inside. So you can use, like, ideally, not ideally, but you should read that token from the headers and validate that actually has been set by Cloudflare instead of some other person pretending to be Cloudflare. So this is basically what library does. It so it's everything you need to do is, if you have an existing plug application, Elixir plug application, you just install the dependency. You add the Cloudflare access plug to your application's router, and all the routes served by that router, if it's a plug up, will be checked for presence of this header. So one thing that you have to do before is you have to configure the domain that it should check for, so it has to know the domain, because Cloudflare, for every, like, the domain that it proxies, it generates, or like Cloudflare Access has been created, it generates a public certificate that you can use to actually verify that the header is set by Cloudflare. So in this, configuring the domain and adding the plug to a router will prevent you from cases where you forget to put back your DNS proxy, or someone is trying to directly access your application. So this library I published today. Before that, it was just part of our code base, but we are actually using it on multiple applications. So it is should be safe to use, and yeah, hopefully it was helpful to you. If not, yeah, feel free to write me up and tell me that. If you have any questions, I'll check whether there are any. Yeah, so so far there are no questions. What I wanted to say is, yeah, then just wrap it up. Thank you for joining us today. Please feel free. Yeah, so we are always looking for speakers. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any ideas, or even if it's just requests for talks that you would like to hear. We can as well try to find someone who is the best to prepare that. Yeah, that will be helpful to us as well. As I said before, also we hope to see you each like all in person soon at an event. But so far, please stick around and chat with us in Discord. Thank you all, and have a nice rest of your day and weekend. Bye.